Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our program, Reintegrating Former Militants into Civil Society. I'm Lisa Swinarski, the Cultural Attaché here at the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad. And the U.S. mission to Pakistan is very pleased to partner tonight with the PAC Institute for Peace Studies. The U.S. government is supportive of Pakistan's efforts to rehabilitate and reintegrate former militants into civil society. And this webinar is intended to revive the conversation on this issue and to share lessons learned. We're especially looking forward to sharing lessons learned from our own country and our efforts in the United States to combat violent extremism, and also to learning from our Pakistani colleagues. So I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Mohammed Amir Rana of the PAC Institute for Peace Studies. Over to you, Amir.
Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction and the collaboration for this webinar. And I hope this will be the first collaboration, because this issue and the topic needs to have the extensive discourse on it, specifically between the US and the Pakistani audience who are concerned with the CVE and counterterrorism related themes. And of course, this is one of the issue, the challenge the Pakistan is facing since many years. And Pakistan has developed its rehab programs for the detainees and other militant groups members. But Pakistan is still facing the multiple challenges. Maybe these challenges, the other countries, specifically the Muslim countries, they are also facing, but the Pakistan case is particularly is complex, and the need for the supporting for the de-radicalization and reintegration of member of the militant groups has increased manifold in recent times, mainly since the Pakistan has started to show the keen interest in taking strict action against banned organizations since 2019, and growing crackdown on the militant groups. And their charity organization is rendering many members jobless, and plan to de-radicalize and reintegrate them into largely missing. Might you be aware of the few recent media reports which indicating that many members of the banned organizations are indulging into the serious organized crimes and radical and extremist activities. But one core area where Pakistan's counter-violent extremism and the counter-terrorism programs, including both executed by the state and civil societies, have been failing, is linked to the development of some comprehensive de-radicalization and reintegration measures for these groups. Pakistan's existing rehab programs or the reintegration programs could be seen that in the regional and the Muslim society's context, and we had developed this program while learning from experiences from Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, and few other Muslim countries. But one of the critical elements which the Pakistan is still struggling with, that we still facing to develop our own program, because our militant landscape is comparatively more complex. This is not the issue of the hardcore terrorists, those who belongs to Al-Qaeda or the Tariq Taliban Pakistan or Daesh or ISIS. But we have the large number of the extremists, those who belong to the banned organizations, which once were enjoying the impunity in Pakistan. And as I mentioned, that after this recent crackdown, and this is getting a more and big serious challenge. So this is one of the challenge that Pakistan is facing. But at the same time, Pakistan is also the existing de-radicalization programs like the Mashal and Sabaun Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Peaceful Balochistan program, they are also facing a challenge that this is mainly operating in the strict security environment. And one of the the issue, the police and other law enforcement agencies' role and the civil society role is missing in all these programs. And today we have Dr. Feriha Peracha, who is one of the founding member of these rehab and reintegration program. And I hope she will enlighten us about these programs, how these are running, and how these programs can make more inclusive. Before I introduce the panelists, so I just want to say thanks to all the participants who are joining us in this course. And of course, we will take your questions. Might we will have, we have the time constraints, we'll not be able to take all your questions, but we will try ourselves to accommodate as much as questions we can. And we also have the few time constraints for the worthy panelists. And each the panelist will have 6 to 7 minutes to elaborate his argument. And my role in this webinar as moderator is only for the timekeeping. And maybe I'll beg in advance, pardon in advance, that I may intervene if there will be we see this time constraint is going out of control. So let me introduce our worthy panelist, Dr. Feriha Peracha. As I mentioned, is a distinguished clinical psychologist and one of the first Pakistani women who practically led a counter-extremism initiative in Pakistan. She served as the director and supervising psychologist for Sabaun project, which I mentioned is the military-led rehab reintegration project, a school which uses academics and religious education, psychology, and other techniques to de-radicalize young boys from Taliban indoctrination. And Dr. Stephen Tankel, it's a long time to see him. He was a very regular visitor of Pakistan, and he has a great knowledge about the Pakistan security and militant landscape, specializes in the international security as well. And he focused on the political and military affairs in South Asia as well. And he served as a US foreign, in some initiative in the US foreign policies. And he had visited many conflict areas across the world and contributed many publications which help us to enhance understanding of these conflicts. Mr. Tariq Parvez, he is one and only figure in Pakistan who was a practitioner, who was academic, and who remain involved in many policy decisions related to counterterrorism and CV related initiatives in Pakistan. He was the first and founder, national coordinator for the Counter-Terrorism Authority, and he also served as the Minister for Home Affairs at the Government of Punjab. As I mentioned, he contributes to the national counterterrorism efforts by mobilizing civil society, and served as the chairman of Initiative for Public Security. Last but not least, Dr. Rachel Nielsen is the director of the Colorado Resilience Collaborative. Her works involve all relevant sectors and stakeholders to combat identity-based violence and violent extremism. She has over 20-year experience in mental health and specialize in forensic psychology, trauma, abuse, violence, crisis intervention, prevention, initiative, and family work such as partnering consultations and therapy with kids. Let's the founding member of the Pakistan's first de-radicalization program. I'll ask her to share with us her experience at Sabaun, and if she can also elaborate how effective can be the de-radicalization program be in the longer run in Pakistan. Dr. Feriha Peracha. Uh, please unmute your mic.
Yes, thank you, Amir Saab. It's an honor to be here on this panel with such distinguished guests. First of all, Amir Saab, I would like to say that Sabaun is an indigenously developed program. We learned from other programs, but I think what we finally ended up with was unique to Sabaun, and we hope that some of the lessons learned will be acceptable to others. Yes, it was Sabaun is about the youth apprehended in the counterinsurgency in 2009, and eventually the action in aid of civil power regulation defined their internment of a sort, which was not, it was not an internment center. There was a large cohort of children and adolescents apprehended in 2009 July, and I profiled the first 12. And what I did realized very soon after is that these children they really did not know what they were doing. And there was, in the first 12, there was no one was ideologically motivated. Finally, by the middle of 2010, there were nearly 250. And we developed a program which had the following modules. Yes, the program is one initiated by Pakistan Army and then handed over to us. And we provided wherever needed. Every child was an individual. Corrective religious education, psychological intervention and psychosocial guidance, academics, sports and recreation was very important. And of course, vocational training center. And at the end of this stay at Sabaun, we had developed a guideline for reintegration and their release out of Sabaun. And that we then presented to the army personnel, and to date, they never refused anybody suggested by us. So yes, Sabaun is successful, has been successful. We reintegrated the last batch in January 2020. It's a holistic program. And I think one of the reasons successful is it's managed by psychologists. It's individualized profiling and subsequent program for each inductee is based on his own push and pull factors, needs and strengths. And last but not least is the continued monitoring and support for the youth that is reintegrated from Sabaun. Just briefly, these are the kinds of activities the youth were involved in, from menial tasks to suicide bombing, arms and weapons training. And this is a pyramid that we think represents their choice according to their cognitive functions. And of course, people moved up and down the tiers depending on how they perform, just like any other job situation. This is what the children are doing now. Quite a few are still in academics. They're in colleges, studying to be lawyers, teachers, physiotherapists, you name it, psychologists, and vocationally established and vocational training continues for some of the students. And we have phased out monitoring of 41 students as of this month, but I think by the end of May, we will have phased out another 40 or 50. This COVID situation doesn't help us from getting the information from the communities. Our first impression was these children are not dangerous in themselves, but they can be made to behave in a very dangerous ways. This perception has not left me from day one. And the question, why were their families so easily convinced and thereby supported the terrorists? I think here we need to address the contextual and alienation issues. These include psychological characteristics, for example, low impulse control, and a lot of them, initially I would say they all had low impulse control. Social alienation, contextual features, and rule of law not supported by security. I think Sawat is a potent example of how gaps in service delivery, particularly access to justice, has been exploited by militants to gain a foothold in the region. High levels of legal cynicism amplify and affect collective support for violent extremism. That is, adolescents exposed to high collective stress and who hold cynical attitudes towards the law are more susceptible to violent extremist attitudes. And I find that this also in the jails that I have visited. The other fact that we need to consider is Sawat and Afghanistan. Sawat shares a long border with Afghanistan. And the shifting perspectives, first supporting the US Army and then fighting against the same army, impacted civil law and authority in Pashtun culture. This long war has inculcated a resentment for authority within Afghanistan, and the same spilled over to KPK and their relatives across the border. Most of the Sabaun boys, when they were targeting the soldiers, they thought it was an American army because this is what they were told. I mean, this is a narrative that just was borrowed from Afghanistan. And again, I think the point about high levels of collective stress and distance from the federally administered law weakened internal moral controls, bonds, and attachments. Importance of monitoring is today, the Sabaun cohort is resilient as they chart their trajectories. However, the vulnerability still exists, as several students have relatives in Afghanistan. Because of lack of job opportunities, which we try to place them, but we can't actually fulfill the need completely. There are some who are not goal directed. I think in the pie chart, you could see about, I think there are 6 students who are not goal directed, and they are my concern every day. Without a continued support for education, vocational skills, the Sabaun cohort may become more vulnerable. So far, we had 0.5 recidivism rate, as only one of our youth from the reintegrated population has reverted to militancy. We were proud at 0%, but 0.5, though low, is very disturbing because this boy was extremely intelligent, but he was ideologically motivated. We knew when we reintegrated him, but he had convinced us that he, with his narrative, that he understood what he needed to do, but obviously not. He joined militancy, went to Afghanistan, and in September 2019, our social workers lost contact with him, and we told the security forces that we don't know where he is, and his family doesn't know where he is either. And he came back on December 18th, 2019, and killed 2 policemen cold-bloodedly from behind. And he recorded the event and sent it to all the top commanders that, hey, I am no longer with the security forces of Pakistan and may be available. Well, it's sad, but he was killed in the counter-strike with the security forces in December. So this is the story of Sabaun. It continues. We are monitoring them. They are very proactive in their communities. You see, it's not 242 students. I think we have impacted 242 communities. These children are ambassadors for their communities. We, of course, don't send them back to their own community unless we know it's safe. But they are proactive in teaching other children, they cleaning the streets. Their families are proud of them. They have changed because of them. Because, by the way, in Sabaun, we used to have regular sessions with the families as well, especially corrective religious education, which was the program for which was devised by Dr. Farooq, as you know, who was martyred in 2010. And I was very sorry to So that's Sabaun for now. There are other projects we've been involved in, but I'll end here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Feriha Peracha, and thank you very much to be precise, and you finish right in time. Let me invite Dr. Stephen Tankel to share his experience, because I recall once he had visited the Sabaun and other de-radicalization center in Sawat. And not only his experiences, but I also want to bring another critical aspect in our discourse, which is the ideological perspective. So how do you see the role of the moderate religious scholars in de-radicalization processes, like the Dr. Feriha Peracha has mentioned about Dr. Farooq, who was one of the moderate scholar and responsible for the ideological component of the Sabaun. So what is your take on this, Tankel?
Well, great. Thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me to join this exceptionally distinguished panel today. And Amir, thank you for the kind introduction. It's been a while since I've been able to visit Pakistan, and hope to be able to return soon. I'll take that question that you posed to me first, and then talk a little bit more broadly about experiences in Pakistan, but also elsewhere. I know that there was an interest in sort of doing comparative analysis to some of the other efforts that have been made globally in this space. In terms of the role of religious scholars, I mean, obviously going to be very, very important when dealing with religiously motivated violent extremism. I'm not sure that, the term moderate, I think, can be sometimes misleading, or at least very least hard to define. Right, in terms of how we see, what one person would consider a moderate scholar to what another one might. And in part, I think the role of ideology matters a lot, and the role of scholars in terms of ideology matters a lot relative to the objectives of the extremists involved, and the position of the state as well on those types of efforts. And I'll use a couple of examples. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, religious scholars were very much a part of the rehabilitation effort. But the main ideological point that they made was that individuals didn't have a right to decide when and where to wage jihad. That was up to the state to determine. And the state had for a long time blessed the traveling to other countries like Afghanistan, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Iraq, what have you, to wage a pan-Islamic jihad. And so that was in some ways seen as acceptable. And what the clerics in Saudi Arabia were trying to argue was, you can only go to those places if we tell you can go, and you can't ever wage jihad here in Saudi Arabia. So, if the aim is actually to get people to stop engaging in religiously motivated violence, that's not necessarily, a message that one would convey. If the objective is to get one to stop engaging in religiously motivated violence in one's own country, then that's a different story. And now we're seeing a lot of challenges with regard to how to rehabilitate and reintegrate foreign fighters. And so we see some of the dangers of using an ideology of pan-Islamic jihad as a way to try to counter violence within a country's borders. So that's, I think, one example of just the fact that ideology can be very, very important, but it can also be a double-edged sword. And I would just add to that also that in a lot of instances, I think where it is most valid is where individuals have a very poor understanding, perhaps, of their own faith, and can be led away, not just sort of redirected in terms of where they do violence, but led away from violence entirely. And again, as I've noted, I think, in Saudi Arabia, there was, that wasn't always the case. In Yemen as well, where it was almost entirely focused on religious scholars' involvement in de-radicalization, it essentially became a get out of jail free card, which was promise not to be involved in violence here in Yemen, and you can leave prison. So absolutely critical to have scholars involved, but also important to recognize that these are complex topics, and the message itself has to be one that will resonate, but also, ideally is one that moves people away from violence entirely. I want to turn now to just a few other points in the remaining time available to me, because I was asked to speak to, I think the wider social and political processes that can facilitate disengagement and reintegration. Much of the focus in violent extremism, disengagement and reintegration is at the individual level. But I would note it's possible to have successful programs like Sabaun with a low recidivism rate and still have high levels of violent extremism if political and structural factors in a country aren't addressed. And here I would note the importance of not only engaging in programs like Sabaun, but also of putting in place programs that are dedicated to disarming, demobilizing, and reintegrating groups. As you, Amir, mentioned in your introductory remarks, Pakistan not only has a lot of individuals who are involved in violent extremism, it also has banned organizations and other groups. And so I think it's important to highlight not just, if you'll forgive the acronyms, VEDR, violent extremism, disengagement and reintegration, but also DDR, disarm, demobilize, and reintegrate. And as I noted, DDR is more at the organizational level. It began actually in Central America during the 1980s and 90s, where it was part of a wider approach to peacekeeping. And it often occurs after a comprehensive political settlement or a clear government victory against an insurgent force, or state fragmentation if you've got outside actors that are able to compel DDR. And it has, it's focused on obviously disarming violent actors, but also severing command and control links. That's the demobilization element. And then the reintegration of those combatants back into daily life. And since the 1980s and 90s, we've also seen it in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and other places where DDR has been used with armed groups, even as military operations are ongoing. And I think, there are some observations from DDR and VDR that we can make that would be relevant for Pakistan. And I will name, I'll make 5 observations and then tie them to the Pakistani context quickly. The first is that the focus of the effort matters. As I already noted, you can have a focus on individuals or on organizations. And in Pakistan, I think both are needed. Among individuals, there have been a lot of focuses on returning foreign fighters. So even the Saudi effort, although it was launched after Saudi Arabia itself became victim of al-Qaeda violence, most of the people who went through the Saudi rehabilitation effort were people who had fought in Afghanistan or Bosnia during the 1990s. Those who'd been involved in violence at home in Saudi Arabia were less likely to go through rehabilitation. There's a lot of focus on the rehabilitation efforts taking place now around the world, as a result of people returning from fighting in Iraq and Syria. Here I would note that a lot of those actually don't focus on returning foreign fighters. They actually focus on families and children, and fears about releasing high-risk individuals who had gone and fought leads to more of a focus on those lower risk offenders. The second point I would make briefly is that the objective of the effort matters. Is the effort to dismantle entirely a militant infrastructure, or is it simply to try to move some individuals out of violent extremism, or to stop attacks at home domestically? The third point I would make, and if I'm over time, I can stop here if you like.
All right. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay.
No, you can. You have little time. Yeah.
I would just very quickly say whether this is happening in a rehabilitation facility, a prison, or a cantonment, those are also going to matter in terms of security concerns, human rights violations, legal issues. Fourth, that the resources that the state is willing to commit are important. And then finally, the environment into which somebody is being reintegrated matters. And there, I think, as you pointed to earlier, there are real challenges within Pakistan, which is to say, it's possible to have a very successful rehabilitation program, but if people are not being reintegrated into a society where there's opportunities to earn sustainable livelihood, where there's social reintegration with families, where there's political integration, having a voice in society, and where the ideological environment writ large is being addressed, then there's going to be limitations to what can be accomplished. So thank you very much, and apologies for going a few minutes.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Tankel. I know that you have few other commitment, but you raise a very important point in a very limited time. But if you have little time for the Q&A, I promise whatever the question you have, you will be the first question I'll refer to you. Yeah, you raise a very important point, all DDR and DDI. And Pakistan, by the way, has experimented all these approaches, all conventional approaches, one way or another. But the problem is that how we can develop a program which should be very comprehensive and cover all the aspects of the militancy challenge we are facing in Pakistan. And this is the question we will ask to Mr. Tariq Parvez, and he has a lot of knowledge about this, about the government practices. And I particularly asked that he was also police officer, and once he has led the anti-militant operations, very successful anti-militant operation in Punjab. How he see the police role in de-radicalization in Pakistan? Tariq Parvez sahab. Sir, unmute your mic.
Thank you, Amir. And thank you, US Embassy, for inviting me to this very important seminar. I'm honored indeed. Thank you. I will confine myself to an initiative taken by police in Punjab to de-radicalize the former militants. And on the basis of that initiative, I would like to recommend give some suggestions on the way forward. But before I talk about the program in Punjab, I would like to make a general comment that Pakistan's response to counterterrorism generally is predominantly kinetic. And the emphasis which is to be given to the non-kinetic measures was ignored. And recently, the government has announced the setting up of a CE commission, Counter-Extremism Commission, which is welcome. Let us see what that commission comes up with. But that was a general observation, that this is the framework in which we are working, where the general approach is to lay more emphasis on kinetics. Coming to this program in Punjab, the de-radicalization program, it was started in 2011 and discontinued in 2012. It was started on the initiative of an officer, of a police officer, who was heading the counter-terrorism department with the support of the Punjab provincial government. And the important alliance of the police in this regard was with TEVTA, Technical and Vocational Training Authority in the province. This program, which was carried out for 2 years, there were 3 sessions, and 300 former militants were de-radicalized. The basic objective was threefold. First, to dissuade them from militancy with the help of their dialogue with the ulama. Second, to address their personality issues through psychologist interaction. And third, most importantly, was imparting them skills so that when they are after the course or after their de-radicalization, they can earn money on their own. Each participant was given rupees 3,000 per month as stipend and free lodging and food. And the skills which they were imparted were calculated on the basis of discussions with the market, with the business people who said that this is the type of skills we need. So on the basis of that, the skills were imparted by TEVTA, an authority which is responsible for imparting vocational training in the province of Punjab. The selection of militants was on the basis of those people who had been trained in Afghanistan, who'd gone from Pakistan to Afghanistan, come back. They were included in these 300. Then the militants who have relationships with, who are associated with the terrorist organizations and are on the Anti-Terrorism Act list, 4th schedule, they were added. And then there were some who had been released from the prisons, who were in the prisons and then they got released. Interestingly, I was told also that the organizations, some of the militant organizations, they expressed interest in giving names of some of their members so that they could be de-radicalized. But that I found it quite interesting. And then as far as the effectiveness of this is concerned, since the project was discontinued after 2 years, I think it's difficult to talk about it. But I was told that there was one case of recidivism where the militant went back to the terrorist organization and was involved in terrorist activities again. What is more important for me was why was the program given up in 2012? And that might give us some insight into what happens when such individual initiatives are taken. Number one, the officer in charge who had been responsible for starting this program was posted out. And his successor probably had a different view on the importance of de-radicalization and probably believed more on kinetic measures. Number two, the provincial government refused to give funds. And they said that we do not have funds to continue this project. And number three was another interesting thing, that some of the de-radicalized boys said that the skills imparted to them were a bit too elementary. And they should have been imparted a more enhanced sort of skills so that they could be really useful for them in getting employments or generating income. Some lessons which we learn from this project. Number one is that without national policy and government support, de-radicalization initiatives likely to be short-lived, individual-based, sporadic, and under-resourced. There has to be a national policy which should guide a standardized approach towards dealing with the reintegration of the militants. Otherwise, these initiatives are likely to die out. Now, the projects which were mentioned by Dr. Feriha Peracha were primarily started by the military and then probably handed over to the civil society or CSO organizations. But I think that there is a need, an important need for the civilian institutions to own such projects, to become aware of the importance of de-radicalization as a tool of counter-violent extremism, which I think is lacking. So that was the first thing, that we need a national policy. NACTA, National Counterterrorism Authority, formulated guidelines for countering extremism policy in 2017, and that is lying pending with the government and not translated into policy. And the second reason was that the efficacy of non-standardized de-radicalization programs. What I am trying to say is that different initiatives were taken on a different basis without there being a standardized format or procedure on how to go about it. And third most important point is the diagnosis of the drivers of radicalization and how best to address these drivers and how best to treat the militants. I think there is a need for research on this to understand the different types of de-radicalization. In this regard, in one of the seminars, we had a discussion with the Law Minister of Punjab province, and there is an organization here, a think tank, National Institute Against National Initiative Against Organized Crime, and the Law Minister agreed to the setting up of a Center of Excellence Against Extremism in the province of Punjab, modeled on another center, Al Hidayah, which exists in UAE and is believed to be a success story. And then there is a lack of expertise in the field about if we want to set up more de-radicalization center, how do we go about it? And yes, I'm winding up.
Thank you, Tariq Sahab, for sharing the very important insights, what is going on in Pakistan, specifically in Punjab. And you mentioned about Hidayah, and there's a lot of debates that either this is one of the successful model or not. But first, we will bring Dr. Nielsen into debate, and she heard the views from Pakistan, and I think she already had the idea how the militant landscape and de-radicalization efforts going on in this part of the world. But my particular question for her, that how she see the interdisciplinary efforts which can address this issue. Can you share with us the some lesson other part of the world, and especially what is your experience, what works and what doesn't, Dr. Nielsen?
Thank you so much for having me. Obviously, there are different issues in the United States where I'm practicing in Colorado, but I find that there are some universal truths about working in this space. And hopefully some of the things that I have to share are helpful in developing what's going to work in your space. In Colorado, we have had ideologically motivated attacks, but we've also had individuals that attacked for personal reasons. We find the term targeted violence to be a good umbrella term just because of the nature of what we face. In fact, not even 2 days ago, we had another attack in Boulder, Colorado, and we have 10 people dead now. And trying to understand what happens in the mind of the person that chooses violence is one area, but also what can the community do, professionals, family, friends, from their unique perspective to try to prevent these things from happening to begin with. But certainly if somebody has already done dangerous things or has fought or has attacked, then how do we manage that person afterwards? what we have found is that people first have a personal issue, and that they begin seething about a perceived injustice, a perceived issue. Sometimes that is a true issue, but I use the word perceived because it may be delusional or hard for other people to understand why the individual is mad about a particular issue. But regardless, the phases end up being that the person begins to become more obsessed with the idea of getting back at people who they think are evildoers or have wronged them. And then they go through a decision-making process where they decide that violence is the answer to make their point or to retaliate. And then we see people in that pre-attack planning phase of deciding a target, who they want to hurt, what their statement is going to be. And of course, at that point, it's a law enforcement issue. But especially here in Colorado, we're very good at the intervention side of things, of being quick to respond when there's an active shooter situation, but we're still grappling with the prevention side. We also have had significant funding issues in the United States. The federal government and law enforcement have come to the conclusion that they do not need to be the lead on these things. And in fact, the bystanders in the community know the most about what's happening with a particular individual, their anger, their changes in behavior. If they are planning an attack, they tend to make threats in front of friends and family. But friends and family don't want to overreact, and they don't want anything terrible to happen to their loved one. So they try to oftentimes deal with it at home. So our solution to having very little funding for this, in part, but also knowing that we have other promising systems in place for mental health care, for community policing, for safety at schools, that we could build on what other people already know. So by providing a basic training to all community members and all professionals, but particularly people who have a lot of contact with the community, it's a force multiplier, as they say, so that people could recognize when someone is becoming more threatening, more angry, and in the early stages could provide support, hopefully a more pro-social way of addressing their issues, maybe some mental health care. But I do want to be clear that most people who go through this process and become violent are not acting because they are mentally ill. Diagnosis is not helpful to us because it's not predictive. And so while there may be mental health vulnerabilities, they tend to be a need for belonging, for identity, for a sense of purpose, poor coping mechanisms around dealing with anger, and like Dr. Peracha was saying as well, poor critical thinking. And sometimes that's because of age, because they're young people and their brains haven't developed fully to be able to use good judgment. So if the people around them, their teachers, their counselors, their faith leaders, their parents, could guide them away from violent solutions, then we would have less of these issues that ended up in the hands of law enforcement. So I think I'll stop there and give plenty of time for Q&A. Oh, you're muted, Amir.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nielsen, for a very precise comment and very valuable argument, specifically about the sense of purpose and critical thinking. I think these are the very important questions, and we are having a lot of questions, the comments, and what I have found that all these comments and questions are around three major themes. One is directly linked to the Pakistan's internal security, clarity, the national action plan. The second is about how the militant mindset works. And one question which came from our former Senator Faratullah Baba about the clarity and transparency in such program and the state approach towards the militant group? Maybe I ask this question, get the very brief answer from Tariq Parvez. Tariq Parvez?
Ji.
Yeah.
Hello. Ji. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. The Faratullah Babar Sahab has raised very important question about the clarity at the level of the state about the militancy, the militant groups in Pakistan, how important it is when we discuss all these de-radicalization and reintegration themes.
I think that's a very, very important question. And to begin with, I would like to state that it all started in 1980. The state was, as a matter of state policy. And that is why the Mujahideen were trained and encouraged. I mean, whether one likes it or not, but it was a state policy in the 80s to radicalize the Pakistani society and to send them to Afghanistan to fight. But I think now there seems to be a realization that this may have been relevant or not relevant at that point in time. And that is why I said in the beginning that we have to give more importance to the non-kinetic measures, the breeding process, the state policies which encourage militancy. So I agree with Mr. Faratullah Babar that this has what has happened, and I think there is a realization. The very fact that the government has decided to set up a CE commission, counter-extremism commission, which will have de-radicalization as one of its important components, is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you, Tariq Saab. And we go to another question from former DG FIA and the Director of National Initiative Against Organized Crime, Mr. Tariq Khosa. And this is linked with the poverty and how important this factor is in radicalization. And does the employment address the grievances and help to reintegrate? Maybe we will get some insight from Dr. Stephen Tankel on this. How do you see, in the global perspective as well? Because usually it's considered one of the important factor, poverty, unemployment. Dr. Tankel.
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. The research on the degree to which poverty is a risk factor for radicalization of recruitment is quite mixed. Right? It's typically more a function of relative deprivation, which is to say, not, it's not I'm poor and so therefore I might be radicalized, but I'm poor relative to another identity group, and I feel like I'm poor because of that other relative identity group can be a driver for radicalization. But I think it's also important to note that plenty of people join militant organizations not because they're radicalized, but because they are recruited for reasons that have less to do with mindset and more to do with with wanting to make money or wanting to have a weapon in a conflict zone where this can be part of a good acquisition strategy. So in that regard, there can be financial incentives. So that's coming in right to violent extremism. In terms of disengagement and reintegration, what the research shows is that typically providing people with skills and with job opportunities and enabling societal integration, or rather community reintegration, in ways that a person will continue to have job opportunities over the medium to long term is more important than simply what the Saudis were doing, which is we'll give you a car or a house when you leave. The car is more useful if the car gets you to your job. Right, so it's more about a longer term employment trajectory, and there it's not just right? It's not just about the job. It's about enabling people to have the skills that they need, but also making sure that they're going to be welcomed back into a community such that they can get and keep jobs over the medium to long term.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I think maybe the Mr. Tariq Kosa is asking this question in the context of the DDR, because in many DDR practices, which is of course a conventional method to deal with these kind of the issues, the employment, they usually engage the guerrillas, the insurgents, they recruit within the security forces. So this could be the reason, and they been engaged in some other such activities. We will come back to you later, but yeah, please, if you have the quick comment.
Yeah, I'll just, because I'm going to have to leave at 11. I will just note that, yeah, I mean, in DDR practices in particular, as opposed to violent extremism, disengagement, and rehabilitation, in DDR, yes, sometimes there is integration into security forces, but not always. Sometimes there is also identification of other employment, and that in part depends on right, on the nature of the conflict and on whether the people who are laying down their arms, you necessarily want to integrate them into the security forces, what the political components there are. So I think, in the Pakistani case, there might be some elements, whom you might wish to be integrating into security forces, and there are others that you might not wish to be integrating. And you're going to be dealing with organizations and individuals. So, I don't think that there's one right answer.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Stephen. We got one particular question for Dr. Feriha Peracha, that what are the impediments and the hurdles in replicating the de-radicalization programs like Sabaun at the national and provincial level? Is it funding, priority, or the enormous magnitude of the issue? Dr. Feriha Peracha? Dr. Feriha Peracha, yeah, please.
Thank you, Amir Saab. I think it is willingness, professionals who are trained to work in this sphere, because I would reiterate that every young person who joins is an individual and he has his own push and pull factors. However, Stephen, I would say that where poverty is concerned, the lower tiers of recruitment are generally the cannon fodder, like, are joined because of poverty. Yes, of course, the higher tiers, let's say those who have conducted horrific acts like 9/11, may not have this handicap of the socioeconomic deficits. I think to replicate the program, first of all, you can't do it like the Saudi program, 3 months of training and 3 months of corrective religious education, and you move on. Not everybody's on the same page at the same time. And I think where the Saudi program did work was the extensive material benefits that they had. I've been to that program, and it's absolutely amazing, the physical structures and the facilities that they have. But I don't think you can do that, 3 months of this and 3 months of that. Our students were in the program for anywhere between 3 months to 3 years or 4 years, depending on what their factors were. And even some whose family members are terrorists or absconders are still being monitored. But I think there is no rocket science to reproduce this program everywhere. Yes, funds are important. But I think more important than all of that is going for preventing violent extremism. And I think this is where we are embarking right now, that if these children lack critical thinking skills, then how do we inculcate social intelligence, critical thinking skills, and empathy in the young, in colleges and schools? And that is showing some results. And there's good methodologies promoted by social scientists, social psychologists. We have to go for prevention, because school dropout 72% by secondary school is ridiculous. What are those children going to do but loiter around the village square ready to be picked up by some miscreant? We have to stop that school dropout rate. We have to ensure that the classroom sizes is not 100 to 1 teacher. that there is the pedagogy of teaching has to change. You have to involve the student. You have to create alternative perspectives. It can't be just one perspective to studying history, for example. So I think that is something we must all work towards.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Dr. Feriha Peracha. Then we got a few more questions, which is linked with social media by Dr. Khalil Ahmed. He's asking to how it play a role in escalating the violent extremism. But may I ask this question to Dr. Nielsen, the role of the social media, if we can bracket it with one of the core point of the sense of purpose. So the freedom in the virtual spaces, can it help to heal the certain radical tendencies usually the youth have all across the world? I think if I'm wrong, if I'm right in that context to Dr. Nielsen.
Yes, thank you. I think the social media space has made things very difficult for us as prevention and intervention practitioners. I think part of the problem is that now it's not necessary to have a direct connection with a person who's part of a radicalized group or a violent extremist group. And so thousands of people can log in, look at the rhetoric. The issue of misinformation has been obviously very damaging because some people are taking up charges around issues based on what they're seeing and hearing on social media that's not even true. And what we know also about social media platforms in particular is that the most polarizing extreme voices are the ones that get traction and attention. And usually people who have more moderate views find it unappealing and leave. So it looks like things are much more serious and polarized than they may have been. We've noticed in the United States, at least, that interest in violent extremist groups is trending younger. So the use of games, of attractive platforms, and flashy things that interest teenagers, it's working. And we do know that just giving them counter information is not enough. That it really does take people influencing and showing interest and learning more about the individual, to Dr. Peracha's point.
Yeah, thank you. Then we have, I think, a couple of questions for Dr. Peracha. One is specifically about the research. It's about why there's restriction, why there's no researches available about Sabaun. Maybe it's question linked to data sharing by the government. But another question, I think, if I get it right, this means how can the de-radicalized male youth disseminate the ideology of enmity amongst other youth to produce harmony in society? Maybe this is in the context Dr. Tamina Aslam is asking. Maybe this few radicalized, after de-radicalization, they've been used as a model to de-radicalize other radicals. For example, Nasir Abbas, Al Imran in Indonesia, or the Majid Nawaz in UK. There's plenty of examples out there. So Dr. Feriha, can this modeling?
Yes, I think, first of all, their safety is of the utmost importance. And some of their recruiters, if they are still on the loose and not yet apprehended, then students know about it, by the way, and then they don't want to be exposed. But there are others who would like to come out there. Remember when Fazlullah took out a video on the net saying that about the APS school, he said that here they're all crying about the children of the armed forces. What about our children? Sabaun has abducted them and taken them away from their mothers. so many of our students wanted to go online and just react against that. So there are brave young souls, and I think, but how do we do it? How are they, unless there are other programs? I really think, for example, this was a special case. There were special laws, but I think there should be a rehabilitation center attached to every jail. And I've spoken with some judges, and they feel exactly the same way. And I think for prisoners, young boys who are on probation, should be given the possibility of going through a program. And there, I think we could certainly use some of our students as role models to work. But I think some kind of permanent, is right at this time, there is a de-radicalization program in Bara, as you know, Sabaun 2, which is run by the Frontier Constabulary. Other than that, there are very small programs here and there in different battalions, but nothing substantial. There should be some permanent structures, I think, affiliated to the jails, because the apprehended now will have to go through the judicial system that exists, and there's no longer an emergency like there was in Sawat, where there were special laws. So yes, a lot needs to be done. How do we do it?
All right. Subal Khan is interested to ask Tariq Parvez the status of the foreign terrorist fighters, especially members of Zenibun and ISIS. They are returning to Pakistan, and how the Pakistan is dealing with them. Tariq Parvez.
Thank you, Amir. That's a very important point about the return of the foreign fighters, particularly from Syria. Zenibun fighting on the Shia side and others fighting on the Sunni side. And that's a very, very alarming scenario. We should be really concerned. My interactions with the different counterterrorism departments in the provinces lead me to believe that they're keeping a record, although it is difficult. I mean, they rarely come through legal ways, and they normally are they use routes which are illegal and do not come into the notice of the counterterrorism agencies. But even then, there is, I think, they have a good record of all the foreign fighters, who most of them, in fact, who have come back. They have identified the areas from where they went to which they belong, and I think they are in the process of compiling data. But probably there is a need to step up efforts and give greater priority to this emphasis. Their number may not be very large, but I think coming from Syria, having fought each other in Syria, again on opposite sides, Shias and Sunnis, this is an area where probably we need to give greater importance and be cognizant of the problem they can create, particularly in the light of the fact that ISK or IS Punjab Vilayat now, or Pakistan Vilayat now, stepping up its efforts to destabilize Pakistan. They would definitely like to contact the people who were fighting for them in Syria and who returned to Pakistan. So while the counterterrorism department and other intelligence agencies are cognizant and they are trying to keep a record, and they have arrested some of them, also interrogated them and found the important information, then the networks which use to send them to Syria. The intelligence agencies have a very good idea about them. I know some of them in Sialkot, Gujranwala, who used to, and similarly in Parachanar and some other areas of KP. So it's an important point. Yes, we need to be aware of it, because I think when we were sending people to Afghanistan, we did not recognize that one day they'll come back to Pakistan. And in fact, terrorism started in Pakistan on a sustained basis in 1990, when these people came back from Afghanistan. So foreign fighters, yes, and maybe there is always a need to do more. But I think that all I can say right now is that the concerned people are aware of the importance of this issue, and they're doing whatever they can.
Yeah, thank you, Tariq Saab. Maybe you recall that a couple of years before, the CTD Sindh, they had rehabilitated the few members of the IS who were returning from Syria. I don't know what kind of the techniques, the program modules that they had used, but now we have come to around to conclude our session, and we have a lot of issues to ask to Dr. Nielsen. She is going to conclude this session, and not only to summarize what we have discussed so far, but to elaborate the two key factors you had mentioned, and Dr. Feriha, Dr. Tankel, and Tariq Parvez as well, the critical thinking, the importance of the critical thinking and the sense of purpose. How they can use it effectively. Is it maybe can be used for rationalizing their own argument, or this mean that critical thinking will enable them to learn about the new perspectives? Dr. Nielsen.
Thank you. As far as the importance of critical thinking, this is where mental health issues can play a part. So while I was saying earlier that a diagnosis for a major mental health problem, a mental disorder, is not helpful in learning who might be at risk for violence or recidivism, what we do find is that out of people who do engage in violent behavior, they may have something like a delusional disorder where they believe things that could be possible but are not true. You could think of people who fall for conspiracy thinking or odd, I suppose, like odd examples of ideologies. And so oftentimes you'll, even within a group, a religious group, a political group, a hate group, for that matter, you will still see that oftentimes that person who is going to be violent isn't really part of those groups either. And so they struggle with the social piece. They struggle to make sense of what is true and what is not, or to consider the source or how people are trying to use them. This is also why people with autism or learning disabilities may be more at risk, because it's harder for them to weigh out what is true and when people are manipulating them. I do think that Dr. Peracha made a good point about the one person that was in her program that did reoffend, did become violent again, that he was highly intelligent and he was ideologically motivated, that takes over his thinking. Whereas other people, I would imagine, that responded so positively to her program, those are people that had some social needs, needed some peace, needed some resolution to issues in their lives. We talked about some of the need for jobs and vocations and training. I did want to make a quick comment about that. we've struggled with the same issue here. If we have good healthcare, if we have good education and training, would that reduce how many people become violent? And overall, it can help to alleviate the stress in a community, but it doesn't seem to reach individuals who are convinced that violence is the answer. So, for example, most of the people that we've encountered that attack others are pretty well resourced. They're smart. These are intentional measures to make a point. And so they're not acting because they're angry about poverty per se. But just as Dr. Tankel was saying earlier, they may be mad about the state of the world. They may be mad about poverty in general and feel like their resources have been taken by others, but probably not because of their personal circumstances. Oh, and I believe you're on mute.
So would you like to conclude the comments on the other panelists' argument? If you think you have a few ideas to share which can help us in Pakistani perspective, at how we can improve our DRAD approaches. One important question I think in this regard, that most of the initiatives in Pakistan going on, which is led by the state, but the civil society participation is very nominal in all these efforts in reintegration and DRAD. Do you think that this civil society and state can develop better understanding, better programs for reintegration for the radicals?
I think the more specific the intervention is for the community, the better, which is why it is great to put power into community programming so that it is responsive to the specific needs of that area. Because around the world, there is a stark contrast between areas where there's a religious or political, I guess, a history of civil war or longstanding religious intolerance versus other areas where it becomes more of an issue of juvenile delinquency and people who are at risk for gang violence and human trafficking and just a whole host of things, and include violent extremism. So the better we get at empowering people at the community level, I think the better the interventions will be. I would welcome any final remarks that my fellow panelists have to make as well, because we're learning so much from each other's spaces.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nielsen. And this was a very wonderful discourse we had on this de-radicalization theme. And we got a lot of participation, and even until now, that the interest is still intact, and we are receiving comments and the questions for the panelists. And we got few more minutes. So let me ask to Mr. Tariq Parvez the one question which is, you already responded in the chat box about the rehab centers with every prison. What is the current situation in the prisons in Pakistan? What I heard that we already have the two high security prisons for the terrorists. Do they have any rehab, reintegration component in these prisons? So this is my first. And traditionally, what we inherited from the Brits, they all the time have one component which is called for the welfare or the education part for every prisoner. How effectively this component is going on? What we got that many religious organizations, including the radicals, have access to these prisoners to have interact and try to teach them about the religion. So Tariq Parvez, your take on this? Tariq Parvez.
Hello?
Yeah, we are hearing you now.
Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Can you briefly sum up what you want?
This is the prisons rehab center at every prison. I'm asking specifically about the two prisons which Pakistan has built for the terrorist. One is Sahiwal, I think the second is in Hyderabad. So do they have, according to your knowledge, any reintegration, de-radicalization component there in these prisons?
I think they do not. And the main emphasis is on security. These are high security prisons, and the main emphasis is that that the terrorists should not be able to break out of these prisons, and it's very strict and all that. But uh, uh, let me point out here for the other participants that the basic issue is the lack of realization about the importance of de-radicalization. Please understand this thing. But I think that's maybe Dr. Feriha can say something on that, because I'm not very sure about this thing, de-radicalizing people in prisons. Maybe the de-radicalization team gets radicalized, because the prison, everybody knows how the prisons are in Pakistan, the way they work. So, but the answer to your question is that the emphasis on these two prisons are
most of the DRAD program across the world, they are basically prison-based program. And I recall once I was in a training session with the prison authorities, and the one of the official was saying that, you know, that you are teaching us to how to deal with these terrorists and militants. You say they don't disturb us. They remain confined only in their corners. They are the other petty criminals. They create problems for us. So they had a very different
true. That's true. That's true.
About the Paracha, final word. Feriha Peracha, are you here? Are you listening us? Maybe she had, and we had very interesting discussion, and it will help us at least. We had plenty of the participants in this webinar, those who have a very important role in the policy making, decision making in Pakistan. I hope they will get the insights on this, and it will help them to come up with better policy options and decision making. Finally, I would like to thank Dr. Feriha Peracha, Mr. Tariq Parvez, and Dr. Rachel Nielsen for your time and very valuable contribution. Let me hand over this floor to Lisa for the final word and vote of thanks. Lisa, please.
Thank you so much, Amir. I think it's been a fantastic discussion, and really want to say thanks to all of our panelists, but especially to everybody who asked a question. That really enriched the conversation. This is obviously a challenge, and I think most countries in the world are probably, you could count on one hand, countries that aren't dealing with the problem of extremism and violence. And so the more we can learn from each other, the better. So thanks to everyone for joining us, and we look forward to more discussions. And thank you so much to the PAC Institute for Peace Studies for collaborating with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you very much, for Lisa and for